Hi, Martin Popoff here. First time in Banger's new studios, very nice. We're doing something special today, something we call Overkill Rewind. We're going to be looking at the top 5 heavy metal albums of 1977 as chosen by you, the viewers. Before everybody gets all upset in the comments, obviously, strictly what we know of as heavy metal today didn't quite exist in the same form back in 1977. Nowadays we would distinguish some of this stuff as hard rock, but back then it was all the same thing. There really wasn't that much to go around. So at the time, hard rock and heavy metal, it was a non-issue. They were essentially the same thing. So yeah, let's take a little look at 1977. Interesting year for music, I think. I was 14 at the time. I was buying most of the records we're going to talk about here as new releases. Other than that, interesting year in that there are some rock and roll tragedies. Elvis dies. There's the Lynyrd Skynyrd plane crash. New York has its blackout. It has its own serial killer in Son of Sam. New York was in really rough shape. Punk was rising, but I think what you're also going to see from this list is that these bands are sweeping aside the heavy metal dinosaurs of the rest of the 70s. So yeah, without further ado, let's take a look at 1977. Coming in at number 5, it's actually a tie. So one of those in the number 5 slot is UFO Lights Out on Chrysalis Records. So yeah, Lights Out is the 6th UFO album, 4th for Michael Schenker, that's very important. This is the title track from Lights Out, probably the heaviest song on the record. I chose that for a reason. Here we go, Lights Out. This is a band that certainly fits in that hard rock category, and this actually, interestingly enough, is one of their lighter albums of the entire Michael Schenker, or even for that matter, the Paul Chapman era to follow. A lot of people consider it the best UFO album, but it isn't that particularly heavy metal. But I think it's in here as somewhat as a tribute to UFO, a marker for UFO, and it was their biggest album of the entire career. Great classic guitar hero in Michael Schenker, melodic music, keyboards, excellent Phil Mogg lyrics. He's kind of like the Bruce Springsteen of the latter, the second wave British heavy metal. We're off to a good start. I give UFO Lights Out 4 out of 5 skulls. Tied for number 5 is Kiss Love Gun. So this is Kiss at their height. What we're going to hear is the Ace Frehley song off of this album, Shock Me.
Your lightning's all I need, my satisfaction grows. You make me feel at ease, you even make me glow. Don't cut the power on me, I'm feeling low, so get my high. Shock me, make me feel better.
This album is definitely not very heavy. I find it one of the weaker Kiss albums in this big bunch of super golden albums of this time. Kiss is working really hard at this point, so maybe we can't really blame them. 1975, Double Live, 2 albums in 76, 77, 78, they do 4 solo albums, and they do a double live album. So they're working really, really hard at this point. So not a great album, but Shock Me is definitely a classic. Love Gun's a classic. I Stole Your Love is a classic. I think this might be one of the weaker Kiss albums, and definitely one of the weaker ones on this list. I'm going to give this 3 skulls out of 5. Now, coming in at number 4, we have AC/DC, Let There Be Rock. Very good choice. This is basically the album where they really start to have a career in North America and the UK on their way to greatness. Let's play a little bit of Hell Ain't a Bad Place to Be. I picked this song because it was a magical moment when AC/DC came and played the big Toronto Rock SARS stock concert out at Downsview here in Toronto to 400,000 people. It was very surprising to see them open with this great old obscure track. So yeah, let's relive that right now.
Tell me
my own personal story about this. When we were kids and I got this album, this was really only the second album in history for us where every single song was heavy. We called it a perfect album because there were no ballads on it whatsoever. The first one was Rainbow Rising from 1976. Challenge me on that, take a look, but yeah, basically no ballads, heavy from start to finish. An interesting thing about this record, what they really wanted to do with this and what they did succeed in doing with this is they really cranked up the guitars. The guitars are super electric and electrocuted and buzzy sounding, and it makes for a very heavy album. And it was a pretty unique band. I mean, this is it was very simple music. They were sometimes thrown into the punk category, but this has classics like Let There Be Rock with the whole sermon about the history of rock and roll, and it has a whole lot of Rosie on it and Problem Child. It's just an album that has a lot of classics on it. And it was a very unique sound, and look at what AC/DC became after this. I've got to give this 5 skulls out of 5 skulls. Coming in at number 3, we have Rush with A Farewell to Kings. So what we're going to hear is something late in the track Cygnus X1 where things kind of fly all off the rails. I think you'll agree. This is another very interesting choice by the viewers. I'm glad it's here. What I like about this as a choice is it's not that heavy metal an album, but if we were to ask our viewers in 1987 for a list, this may not be on here. It might be a different list. It might be something that's a little more leaning towards hard rock, pre-hair metal kind of thing. But Rush is interesting in the aspect that not a very heavy album, but it's progressive, it's dark, it's daring, it's very artistic and creative, and heavy metal is all those things, and Rush is one of the precursors of that. Even though it's not that heavy an album, our viewers are smart enough to realize that there are other things besides, you know, molten guitar riffs that make up, you know, the philosophy or the oeuvre or the ethic of heavy metal, and that is in the DNA of these early Rush albums. For all the great things Rush has done just for creativity and art, and for the fact that many a deep Rush fan love A Farewell to Kings, and so do I'm going to give this 5 skulls out of 5 skulls. We're almost at number 1 here. I'm dying to show you guys what number 1 is, but for number 2, we have Motorhead with their self-titled album, Motorhead. This is a heavy, strange, daring album. Is it a punk album? Is it a biker rock album? Who knows? But let's take a little bit of a listen to a song off of it, one of the originals off of it. There are covers. This is a song called White Line Fever. Interesting choice. It's not a surprising choice, but I love that it's kind of an obscure, cultish choice where all of the other records that we're hearing on here are more or less on major labels. Motorhead came out on Chiswick. It came out at the height of punk, but they're long-haired guys. This is Lemmy. He's coming from Hawkwind. The other guys don't have much of a history at all. It's just basically a big mystery, this record. But it's a really nasty, almost recorded badly on purpose record. That's a very interesting point because in heavy metal there are certain specific ways and bands later on that will record badly on purpose. I just love the fact that that it is a record that is a big precursor to a lot of things that would happen to heavy metal in a whole different way that we just talked about with the Rush album, but it does do a similar thing. It is a real sort of a DNA ground level record for heavy metal and heavy metal that was to come. Now, me personally, I don't think this is a great Motorhead album. I think it's probably one of their worst albums. They made great improvements with the 2 albums to come, Overkill and Bomber, and then Ace of Spades, of course. So for those reasons, and also because I never really took to this sort of really bad production at the time, I'm going to give this 3 skulls out of 5 skulls. Now, we're at number 1 on our list of the top 5 hard rock and heavy metal albums of 1977. And I've got to say, we have very, very smart viewers here. This is an excellent, excellent choice. This would have been my choice as well. It's a runaway winner. It got the most votes by a long shot over anything. Judas Priest, Sin After Sin. For those of you who don't know this album, and shame on you because it is an absolute classic of heavy metal, well, actually our viewers have kind of argued that it is the only album on this list that is a true heavy metal album. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But no, Sin After Sin, absolute classic. It's the follow-up to Sad Wings of Destiny, 1976. It's the precursor to Stained Class, 1978, which are absolute milestones of heavy metal. And this, I would argue, is an absolute milestone of heavy metal as well. And to prove that fact, we're going to play a little clip from Dissident Aggressor. So yeah, that was Dissident Aggressor, an absolute heavy metal classic, and proving that it's an absolute heavy metal classic, Slayer covered it on one of their studio albums. So there you go. Basically what you have here is an album that has speed metal on it in Let Us Pray. It's got super high vocals from Rob Halford. Dissident Aggressor is a grinding, complex, progressive song. This album is almost as progressive as Rush, Farewell to Kings, but it isn't progressive rock. It's truly progressive heavy metal. Rob Halford is the metal god. We all know that. They were big in the new wave of British heavy metal. They were big with the identification of heavy metal in all manners, in the lyrics, in the look, with the bikes and the studs and the leather. And this record is just a really smart album. They've got a studio drummer in here in Simon Phillips who does excellent drumming. Roger Glover produces it. It's got a very thin, austere, strange, obscure production sound. Everything about this record is really smart. So yeah, no question, I agree with everybody that this is a classic, and I have no reservations whatsoever to give this 5 out of 5 skulls. So there's our top 5. Tell us what you think in the comments. I'll tell you what I think. I generally like this list. I find possibly the UFO could have been replaced with something like a Thin Lizzy, Bad Reputation. Also, the Kiss could be replaced to lean it more heavy metal and to give it a good solid, this is an unassailable list. I find a big missing, album on here is Scorpions Taken by Force. Another, key heavy metal band, and their album that is probably the most loved of the catalog, and it's got some really heavy songs on it, like Steam Rock Fever and The Sails of Charon. Other honorable mentions that I thought were great were things like the Sex Pistols. Never mind the bollocks, here's the Sex Pistols. That was actually the next album that we got as kids that had no mellow songs whatsoever on it. Another big one that I find that's not here that's interesting, or two that go together, is Aerosmith Draw the Line and Ted Nugent Cat Scratch Fever. If we had done this in 1987 and hair metal was all the rage and all the big bands from the 70s kind of were still around, I think you would have seen the Aerosmith and the Ted Nugent in there. But now, given that we're talking heavy metal versus hard rock, I think the idea is that most of our viewers would probably class those two albums in the hard rock category. So I can understand. Overall, I think this list is a really, really good list. So I congratulate the viewers again. You did a very good job. And I have to say that if you like 1977, I've written books on all of these bands, I think except for Kiss, actually, and some of the honorable mentions as well. But anyways, I hope to be back to do future years. See you next time.